So grateful to all of you. So delighted by your enthusiasm, your interest. My name is Michael Kenney, and I'm privileged to be your host for this afternoon's event. I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic group of colleagues. We're each going to address some opening remarks, and then we're going to go to the questions, okay? We received a fantastic set of questions from the people that were registering. So I'm going to start with a few of those, and then we're going to open it to the floor, okay? This is a big room, and I'm deaf, right? So don't be shy. You don't need to shout, just verbalize your question. But first, please identify who you are and what your, institution is. ISPIA, or you're from another department, we'll do that. Okay, delighted to have some special guests today. Appreciate, folks making the time to come out. Thank you. Okay, excellent. First, I want to introduce our panelists. To my immediate left, we have Dr. Jeremy Weber. Jeremy is a professor here at ISPIA. He researches the policy and economics of environmental and energy issues. He has extensive policy experience. In fact, he worked for the first Trump administration at the White House. He was a senior economist, or chief economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, where he co-authored several White House reports. He is also the author of a book that if you don't have, you really need to get. It's called Statistics for Public Policy. Great book. Actually, you have a copy of it.
Christmas is coming up. Great stockings.
Great. Next up, to Jeremy's left, we have Dr. Siyao Li. Siyao is an assistant professor of international affairs here at ISPIA. Her focus is international political economy and international affairs. Her research focuses on the politics of foreign direct investment and trade and business-government relations. She also specializes in China's political economy. Then we have Dr. Andrea Pena-Vasquez. She is also an assistant professor of international affairs here at ISPIA. Her specialty is migration. She researches migration governance, legal status, identity documentation, and race and ethnic politics. She, like all of us, in Andrea's case, she's recently published in the Washington Post Monkey Cage, other publications, and her work has been supported by different grants. And then you're stuck with me for the last bit. I'm a professor here, and I am a student of violent extremism and political violence. A lot of my research over the last decade has been focused on an outlawed Salafi jihadi group based in the UK, but also since 2017, I've done a lot of work on anti-fascism and anarchism here in the US and a little bit in Europe. And so given recent events, there's been some demand for that side of my research. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just we can go down the row. Each one of our panelists will open with some remarks featuring their area, and then we'll move on to questions. Jeremy?
For coming. There's a great group of questions. I'm going to defer commenting on any of them till we've all talked. I know change can be hard, but it's important to talk about, and so I'm glad that everybody showed up. I want to first just say a bit of the nature of my experience, which obviously colors my perspective on a variety of these questions. In 2019, I went on loan from Pitt to the Council of Economic Advisors, which is like an internal think tank within the executive office of the president. It's primarily staffed by civil servants from other agencies, Federal Reserve, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's a congressionally mandated group to basically provide economic input to whoever will listen. And that's sometimes a small group, sometimes a larger group. So that colors my experience. So it's civil service, it's then professors who come on loan who have subject matter expertise and then kind of have that domain. And only at the top is the politically appointed leadership. So the chairperson and 2 members are appointed by the president. They are the commissioned officers. Everybody else is basically, nerds like me and my great colleagues there. So that was my role there. 2 things I'd like to highlight just here in the intro is one, there's often more continuity from one administration to the next than what you would think based on either administration comments or media comments. Nobody writes stories on the policy that's still the same or the policy that's 90% of the old policy. The administration, if it's a different party than the prior administration, it obviously doesn't have much incentive to highlight that, so it won't. And the media generally isn't going to focus on that. So, for example, Biden kept all the Chinese tariffs and then raised the bar on electric vehicles and solar panels. So that's kind of one area of continuity. That the administration is not going to be touting, oh look, we actually think that's a good idea or whatnot. And so I imagine there'll also be some continuity going into the second Trump administration, and that won't get highlighted, or at least not highlighted in that way. That's of course not to say there aren't stark differences. Clearly there are. I'm just saying that the commonalities won't be put on display by anyone, or at least not in a big way. The second thing is there's more heterogeneity within an administration than you might expect, more internal debate and conflict. I obviously can't speak to what that was like in the Harris administration, or the Biden-Harris administration, though I do know a few folks who were on the council at that time. But certainly my experience in the Trump administration was there's some pretty serious discussions and diversity of perspectives at the table that got hashed out. You won't see that. What you'll see is either the policy never got to the public, or only the policy that ended up being winnowed and decided by the president or the principals got to the public. You won't see all of the wide range of perspectives considered. You'll just get the end result. So that can also make it look like any given administration is more of a monolith. Clearly in the second administration, you're going to see a populist kind of current washing up against a wave of more of a conservative current. And they're not always the same on policy. And that's going to get worked out internally a lot. And you might not see that. So I'll stop there and we'll move on.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeremy.
To echo my colleagues, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you to Michael for inviting me to be part of this discussion. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the executive power the power that the executive has over immigration matters. And most of this is concentrated in the ability to direct administrative agencies, so long as it doesn't contradict any legislation passed by Congress. Entry restrictions, particularly any of those that can be related to national security, and issues of refugee resettlement, the refugee resettlement program in the US. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the mass deportation plan, because that's been receiving a lot of widespread attention, and rightly so. The emphasis has been mostly on undocumented or irregular immigrants, but the effects are probably going to be widespread. And it's not without any precedent. Operation Wetback took place during the Eisenhower administration. So take a look at that when you get the chance. But this included American citizens. And so it has important repercussions for civil rights, human rights, the children of the US-born children of undocumented immigrants, and questions about the use of military tactics internally. The second thing is we might see more immigration federalism, a crackdown on cities and states that have sanctuary statutes, and those are ones that do not cooperate with immigration authorities. And so this could trigger a lot of legal battles over sort of the role of the federal state and the role of states and cities. There will be high costs. Deportation plans include costs of apprehension, detention, processing, and removal. Obviously, there would also be impacts on families, communities, labor markets, taxes. Some of the estimates about the cost of such a big plan are around $88 billion a year. And that's only in the cost of those four things I mentioned. And there are, of course, alternative policy options, right, related to how to manage a large irregular population. Some other options include legalization, or otherwise known as regularization or amnesties. I can talk a little bit more about in the Q&A, interested. For the sake of time, I'll move on. As far as refugee resettlement goes, it's likely that we'll see a sharp drop as we did in the first Trump administration, which we saw record lows, perhaps an end to humanitarian parole programs, which right now mostly help Venezuelans, Haitians, Afghans, and Ukrainians, among other groups, or at least a significant scaling back of those programs. It is likely that we'll see a reintroduction of the Muslim ban, as well as the addition of ideological screenings for different immigrant classes. In addition, I expect that we'll see more border externalization, so sort of pushing the border away from the physical border. And so this will demand more reliance on cooperation with Mexico, particularly with the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum. And during the campaign, he threatened to impose tariffs, sort of to make those, to make them a bit more compliant in that assistance that will require. And the last thing that I wanted to address is sort of plans to end birthright citizenship, which I think is the least feasible of the proposed plans, in part because birthright citizenship is a constitutional matter, and so that would require just a lot more than an executive order. And so, you know, birthright citizenship comes from the 14th Amendment that would require overturning or changing a constitutional amendment. So I think that of all of the plans, that would be the least feasible. It's also a big no-no in the international community to do anything that increases potential statelessness. So I think as far as order of operations, I think the first thing we might see is this deportation plan, although because of the cost, potential costs, it's hard to say whether it's going to actually go through. It seems to be fairly somewhat unpopular, but I think once they actually start going into, you know, what will this mean, what will it cost, I think that we'll be revisiting that conversation. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. My topic is political violence in the United States and the weeks and months ahead, something that a lot of folks have been in my field, terrorism studies, violent extremism, a lot of folks are thinking about, concerned about. I'll start with the good news. The good news is that given the election, the prospects for a MAGA-inspired insurrection or civil war or a repeat of something like J6 that we saw 4 years ago, the prospects for something like that have declined. The guys in the White House now, right? So now, that doesn't mean we're not going to potentially see more violence on the far right. Actually, one of the interesting things that happened in the early years of his first administration, 2017, was actually an uptick in violence by the far right. Why? They won. They were also emboldened. So you had a number of groups, Patriot Prayer, the Proud Boys, various militia groups, they kind of stepped up their game and became even more active, more aggressive, and more violent. So I would not be shocked to see an increase in that sort of violence. One of the The events we'll all remember from 2017, the Unite the Right protest in Charlottesville, right? We remember that. So something like that is certainly not out of the question. Now, one thing why I wanted to mention Unite the Right is because there was a flip side to that violence, right? There were two broad sets of actors involved. And that is important for us to remember, right? You know, the anti-fascists have a saying, we go where they go. So when they see an increase in activism by folks they identify as Nazis and fascists, they respond to that. They organize in response to that. And their escalation to violence tends to be reciprocal. So if they're at an event and they expect shouting, then they go there ready to shout. If they're at an event where they expect Nazis to throw punches, they'll go there and they will punch a Nazi in the face. Remember from his first inauguration, that became a big thing when Richard Spencer got punched in the face by a masked anti-fascist. It went viral, became this huge thing, right? That's kind of how it up. There is an escalation of violence. If one side brings knives, the other side brings knives. That's kind of how it works. They know what each other are doing. They follow each other on social media. They communicate via encrypted apps. So they're aware, right? The folks on the far left, they're not stupid, right? They're actually quite astute. People that I've interviewed and met with and followed over the years, they're not dumb, right? And so they understand what is going on, and they see Trump and other fascists as an existential threat. And for them, you don't debate existential threats. You push back against them. So there is that potential, okay? However, I stress potential because part of this is going to depend on how the state responds to that. If Trump does what he says he's going to do and cracks down against the anti-fascists and the anarchists, then I would expect to see an escalation in violence from them, because that's how they operate. The state cracks down against them, they escalate their violence. So that's what I would expect. Let me end with one last threat that I think that you should be aware of, and that's the lone actor threat. I think that actually the likelihood of that is still out there. We've seen it this past summer, these assassination attempts. These were essentially lone actors out on their own, radicalized, different sources. They're angry, they want to strike out, they want to be famous. You know, whatever the motivation is, they're willing to use violence to get there. And I do think that the lone actor threat is another thing that we want to be aware of. So I'll stop there. And we're going to now move to questions. Like I said at the outset, we had a great set of questions and that you guys submitted ahead of time, and I was able to share those questions with the panelists. So they actually already addressed many of the questions that you shared with us, but there were some that we didn't address, and I want to go in reverse order this time. Andrea, could you address the question that, I think it was question 13, will discrimination against international students get worse?
So I think the answer is likely, but not necessarily as a direct result of the election, more as an indirect result. I think that sort of the rise in nativist rhetoric that we're seeing is a big contributing factor to that and to the discrimination that we see against, all people of international backgrounds. I think that it will be concentrated with certain communities. as we saw sort of with the rise in anti-Asian sentiment, as a result of the COVID rhetoric, I think that it will be sort of concentrated among certain communities, particularly Hispanic, Latinx people. But I think that it's one of those kind of indirect consequences of the rising nativist and xenophobic issues that we've been seeing across. So I think it's likely to be perpetuated by private actors, individuals, the hate groups that you mentioned. It's also a question of whether or not there will be protections against these kinds of acts, whether there will be any response or any consequences for people who engage in any kinds of acts.
Thank you. Our next question, again submitted ahead of time, is for Jeremy. It's actually a combination of two questions, and I'm going to read them out together, so it'll sound like one, kind of. So, are there any government organizations that can serve as boundaries or pushback if things start becoming way too damaging for the country and the system? What is the likelihood of bureaucracy or the administrative state to restrain the more extreme positions and ideas that we might see from the incoming administration?
Yeah, great question. The bureaucracy, which is part of the executive branch, is really not meant to be the constraint on the bureaucracy. The executive branch is not its own constraint. Designed as the Constitution is, that happens via Congress and the courts. So I wouldn't expect it to be the primary constraint. It is under the leadership of the elected official that runs it. It also is not unheard of for an administration to implement a law via or carry out its authority via executive order or regulation that it knows is pretty much outstep with statute, with congressional intent or law, and that this is likely to get struck down. Right? That happens. When is an administration acting in goodwill? When is it just we're going to see how long we can get away with this? That happens. That would not be a unique thing to the Trump administration. It took a lot of Supreme Court blows in the first administration, and it will encounter the same thing. The way this works is simply the day a regulation gets finalized or an executive order is pushed, there's probably somebody, some party who is expected to have standing will file a suit, and then eventually that finds its way in court. And then if it gets struck down, then the administration goes back to the drawing board and basically asks, okay, given that court ruling, how can I tweak this so that it can slide by again? And we saw this happen with student loan forgiveness, and I would expect that to continue. Now, this does raise a broader and I think hard question of what is the proper role of the bureaucracy and administrative staff, civil service. I was a civil service employee in a federal statistical agency for years. I recognize it's very valuable to have expertise. We want integrity in the statistics that are being produced. People who are approving drugs and looking at the results of drug trials, we want them to be professional. We don't want that to be politicized. So I fully get that. At the same time, I also see it as it's a problem if an elected leader comes to an agency that's under its authority and said, we want a different policy, and it's within the scope of the statute, and the unelected staff says, oh, but if we were elected, we wouldn't choose that policy, so we're going to resist you. I also find that lack of responsiveness a problem. Now, where do you draw the line to ensure that there is professional staff, that those statistics and drug approvals and environmental standards do have integrity, but yet are also recognized that as civil service staff, they are not the policymaker, they are not the elected official, the authority does not come with them. So I don't have a good answer to that, but those are some of the issues in play.
Yeah, I think other organizations for us to think about in terms of serving as boundaries or pushback is we also have to think outside the state, right, to other organizations in civil society. I'm obviously thinking of here, for example, of the media, right? The media are going to have a very important role to play over the next several years as as they have in recent presidential administrations. So I would expect to see that. But also civil society, right? And I think that's a really important point for us to remember because we are civil society. We have a role to play in this. We have some say. We have agency in terms of, is this the society that I want to live in? So I think that's also very, very important to remember as well. Yeah. And then the last question from the pre-submitted ones, and I'll take a first crack at it, and if anyone else wants to add to it, you're welcome. What is something that you think the Trump administration might do better than the current administration, or something that you might try to fix or improve? I love this question, and one, I thought of several things came to mind, but I just want to mention one. And if you guys have any others you want to bring up, feel free. I feel like the war in Ukraine provides an excellent opportunity for the Trump administration. Although we talk a lot about the Trump administration, the incoming administration's leverage over Ukraine, certainly very considerable given that we're the ones that provide most of the weapons. I do believe that the incoming administration, if it chooses, will have considerable leverage over the Russians, right? We have been sending some very powerful weaponry to the Ukrainians, but there's always a catch, right? There's conditions that they're not allowed to use those weapons under certain circumstances. For example, those long-range missiles that we've been sending them, that they have, and we can certainly send more, can reach deep into Russia and hit targets that thus far the Biden administration, has said, no, we're not going to go there. And there's very good reasons for that. My point is, for the Trump administration and Trump's reputation as, an out-of-box, spontaneous thinker, he could tap into that. And he could go to his buddy, Vladimir, and he could say, hey, it's not just about getting the Ukrainians to accept it. You guys also need to accept something. If you don't, then these missiles that they have are perfectly capable of reaching several hundred miles into your country. So if he wants to make a deal, we all know the man wants to make a deal, he has leverage. It's a question of whether he's willing to use that or not. So I do think that's one, I'll call it an opportunity for the Trump administration. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I do think it's something that they could explore. And I actually think they're starting to do so if you read some of the pronouncements of the people that are getting appointed. I don't know if anyone else has with this question.
So I think that this issue, particularly following kind of a mass deportation, if that were to take place, I think obviously it would have important effects on labor, right? And so I think that potentially we might, if this were to take place, the incoming administration could maybe seek to engage in more guest worker type of programs. And there's debates about the effectiveness of them, but it would allow, kind of maybe more of a match between labor market needs and workers. So that is potentially an opportunity with the new administration, but I think that it's difficult to say if it would be effective, and I think that it would be contingent on a variety of factors. But I think that could potentially be, if this mass deportation goes into effect, that could be potentially the following step.
Great. Thank you, Andrea.
Do you want to come in?
It's okay. It's okay.
All right.
Something, Jim?
Yeah, I'll just say, related to several other questions, there was a comment about gutting the administrative state. I do expect there to be some shakeups in the federal government. I mean, under the first Trump administration, there was kind of a move to, hey, some of these jobs don't need to be in downtown DC. Why don't we distribute them across the country in places with lower cost of living, reduce the congestion in DC, the money will go further there. So my old agency, the Economic Research Service, got, if you weren't in favor of it, you might have called it exiled from DC to Kansas City. All right, that took some, political, like, we're going to get this done, because that's moving a lot of people to, like, your job's here now. And there was a transition period and whatnot, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of that. And I could see some upside to, hey, there are a lot of jobs that are currently require you to be in DC, the offices are in DC, and they don't really need to be. So I can see that as happening and potentially being a good thing, depending on what it is. I think that probably the National Environmental Policy Act is something that you probably don't hear a lot about. I think the process for carrying that out will get reworked, probably. I think kind of everybody agrees it's currently pretty Byzantine. It takes 4 to 5 years for the average project to get its environmental review done. Like, if you can't identify the major environmental impacts in a year or two, like, you shouldn't be doing that job. And I think some reforms could be made, and that touches more things than you might expect. So basically, anything that, say, a state or private entity wants to do that has a nexus with a federal agency's decision has to be reviewed under this National Environmental Policy Act. Basically, all the environmental impacts identified, depending on the scale of the activity, it might be a quite extensive review. Those are currently taking a long time, very costly. That means that only really large companies can do it because only they have the deep pockets to do it. It's affecting a lot of renewable power development. So wind projects in particular actually take even more than 4 or 5. I've seen an analysis of those permits. So I think that's something that there's an opportunity to streamline it and have it just be a bit more of a sane, efficient process. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Great, so we have plenty of time for more questions from the floor. Raise your hand, I will call on you. And again, identify who you are, and I just saw a hand over there. Someone, yes, you, sir.
Hi, my name is Cengiz. I'm an undergrad studying economics. Professor Weber, just going off what you were just saying, if you haven't heard, the EPA has a new head, and I was just wondering, how do you foresee the EPA operating under this type of person who is a deregulator who doesn't have much experience in the environmental sector? Like you were just talking about wind projects. Do you see those projects still existing under this new head?
Yeah, well, start by saying, surprisingly, it's not uncommon for people to be selected to lead agencies about which they previously had no connection. That's more common than you might think. Like the Secretary of Ag needing to be briefed on just the basic crops that the U.S. produces. That's not unheard of. So it's always better when there's more overlap. I would imagine him to follow through more or less with what the administrators in the prior Trump administration did. Administrator Wheeler, they're going to be doing a dereg push. They're going to be looking for things that they can loosen, and some of those, probably have a better argument than others. For example, with the fuel economy standards, which EPA makes with DOT, you might have thought, based on kind of how it was presented in the media, that the prior Trump administration was like totally removing that or taking it back to 1980 levels. All it was doing was really slowing the rate of increase. Now, will Zeldin pursue that type of, okay, we're just going to slow it down? Or is it going to be a more like existential, we want to reconsider the entire merits of fuel economy standards? I don't know. I would say that the first attempt at that was fairly marginal. It was kind of incremental. We're just going to slow the rate of increase from 2% down to 1.3% or whatever it was, increasing the standard per year. But yeah, like I said, internally, there's probably going to be some pretty big conversations, and that's going to determine whether it's, or maybe a symbolic or tweak that nonetheless fits the dereg agenda, or a more deeper, we think these standards have totally gone off the rails, and we're going to go after them more fundamentally.
Are you dusting off your resume?
No, I'm not. I've got 2 young kids that appreciate me not working long days. But no, I don't plan to be going back to Washington. Though I really hope good people do. I mean, there's a lot of roles in the administration, both in the civil service and in these kind of not political, but very political environment type roles where, you want good people interpreting the numbers, thinking through the implications. You want people sitting at the table who can say, like, this is how tariffs work. And so that the decision's made knowing, some of this is going to get passed on to consumers. And the more revenue you're collecting from your tariff means the more it's getting passed on to consumers, because you can't have that both ways. And before I went the first time, I asked a friend or a colleague at Yale who had been in actually Republican and Democratic CEA, and I asked him, would you do it again? This is good. He's like, absolutely, they need good people. Somebody's going to be there. Somebody's going to be providing advice. And so I did it. I was very glad I did do it. But that doesn't mean, it's like a good ride at a park. Like I did it once, and it doesn't mean I have to go back on the ride. Maybe in the future, 10 years from when my kids are out of the home, and I can take long hours again.
Well, good news for your family is good news for Gisman. Okay, now we have other panelists too. He's just answered a couple of questions, so what I'd love to do is field a question for Siyao, Andrea, not me.
Hi, Donatito. I'm a PhD student in first year. The question goes to Andrea. The campaign pledge on mass deportations is something that I think he promised in the first administration. Not as that, but the border, and I'm just thinking about, you sort of alluded that it may or may not happen on the scale that he's promised. One, we've seen with his appointment of the border sir. He seems to be a very serious guy, and he's promised that I'm going to do this. What will be the implication for voluntary deportations? I'm not from the US, but my family has been calling and saying, hey, pack your bags and just come back home before you're deported. Do you expect people just voluntarily leaving the US, and what will the implications be? And then number 2, you talked of refugee settlements on how those reduced in the first administration. I'm curious about asylum applications. What will be the implications for asylum applications during this term of office?
Thank you. These are great questions. So the first one about voluntary repatriation, I think there's been a lot of studies, not only focused on the US, that look at what are the impacts of human rights violations on migration. And generally they find that they're not super effective in sort of reducing immigration. This was something that was seen in the UK, what was referred to as a hostile environment, sort of creating the conditions that make life pretty difficult for immigrants in order to encourage them or incentivize them to voluntarily return to their countries of origin. And generally, those have not been super effective. More so, what is generally effective is sort of the sides of the economy has more of an impact on migration flows. So I don't think that we'll necessarily see a rise in voluntary repatriation. I also think voluntary is a bit of a misnomer. I think it's more coerced, to be frank. The second, I actually don't think we'll see a whole lot of change in asylum applications. And the reason for that, asylum applications at the border are different from resettlement numbers. So resettlement is, when the U.S. is a third country, people who have already been living in camps, they've been vetted, generally we sort of choose which refugees get resettled and they're dispersed to different communities via resettlement agencies in the U.S. These are mostly faith-based. So that is a set of quotas that is determined by the president, and which is why I said that there were historic lows during the first Trump administration that had increased during this Biden administration, not to the same levels that they were pre-2016, but fairly close. But asylum applications are those that take place at the border, and those have been pretty much decimated by the Biden administration, sort of citing that continuation of Trump policies that we saw during the pandemic and sort of subsequent economic downturns. And also the border externalization, Remain in Mexico program, and the cooperation we saw with Mexico. And so I think that the number of asylum applications will remain fairly low, but that will be a function of the things that we are doing to keep people from applying to asylum in the first place.
Great, thank you, Andrea.
Scott Morgenstern in Political Science Department. But you mentioned the civil society and how this is going to come out in protection against different changes. There's been such wholesale changes. I'm wondering what models you're thinking about of what protest is going to look like. What groups can form? And this maybe goes to Andrea a little bit too, that Latino groups who have been strongly advocating are in a lot of danger. And it's going to be very difficult for many of them to have the kind of impact that they had because they won't have as much recourse to the courts, perhaps, as before. But other policies, whether they be economic or abortion or all kinds of different things, plus the very high level of polarization leads to a lot of protest. And you study this for a lot of different countries. I'm curious about what you're thinking about what protest might look like over the next while.
Okay, so when I think about what we might be seeing over the next few months, I think back to 2017 and what we saw there. So what I see on the anti-fascist end of things is that folks are starting to organize, okay? They're starting kind of low level, basically like reach out to your people, reconnect with your affinity group. Don't have time to go into that, but it's basic unit of organization for these folks, group of friends, reconnect with your friends, prepare, get ready. And again, so I do expect I don't think we're gonna see a J6, disputing the results, right? That would have happened if the other side, I don't see that happen, in part because of the margin of victory. I mean, he didn't just win, but he won convincingly. Biggest electoral vote margin since Obama. So it's a significant victory. I think what we could see is for the inauguration. I think that's kind of the next big thing that's coming down. I think that it's far enough out there that folks now are going to start to mobilize. They're going to organize. I think we're going to see this on both sides. And, where it goes from there is really anyone's guess. I do think that the state has a key role to play in this. If Trump does what he says, and, I'm going to be a dictator on day one, and part of that is cracking down on the protests, then I don't see those protests as dissipating. I see them as galvanizing and spreading and becoming more pronounced. So I do hope, so that's what I think is the next kind of big test, if you like, that might be coming. I'll stop there. Time for one more real quick question. I'm sorry, Mark, I'm gonna go with Marion. Go ahead.
Hi, this is directed to Dr. Kenney. I noticed a couple nights ago that you posted on the Ridgeway Center having a discussion with Palestinian American activist Linda Sarsour, and that you proposed a question to her of what you would tell your students, or what you should tell your students regarding the Gaza-Israeli war going on, and if that's going to have an effect against Arab and Muslim Americans here in the States.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Marion. So she's referencing an Instagram live video with Linda Sarsour a couple of nights ago. Linda Sarsour is a Palestinian American, very prominent activist here in the U.S., very involved in the Gaza struggle. So I asked her, what would you say to my students? She said, I like this question, Dr. Michael, and I'll tell you why. Students are the backbone of any movement in America. There has never been a time when we didn't have to fight for our rights. When it comes to issues around reproductive rights, immigration reform, there's much work to be done. So you are the generation we need in this moment. Keep up the fight, don't stop, but also focus on your studies because we need smart activists, end of quote. So let's end it there. I thank you all for coming. I want to thank our panelists. I also want to thank the team that made this possible. It takes a village. Corinne, Matt, Maggie, Trifty, Jillian, Paula, Nick, Andy, Nicole, and Jean Slaughterback. Thank you all. Thank you, Justina Jess, for joining us. We have plenty of time outside. We got a brief young glass. We can continue the discussion outside and in the